Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're talking about the Surki, the one of the more interesting ancestries I think that have come out of Pathfinder for quite some time. I know this video has been a little bit late. A lot of stuff has happened over the weekend, and also, if you've been noticing the slight cuts and audio problems, I have too. There's going to be a new mic soon, so just want to get that all out of the way for these ongoing videos I've been doing for Howl the Wild. But let's go ahead and talk about the Surki. So the Surki are incredibly interesting, a very versatile and dynamic ancestry that can work in a lot of different campaigns and are perfect for adventurers. Surki are innately individualistic. They're even a species that is asexual, and we're not asexual, but well, I guess yeah. They reproduce through parthenogenesis. So they don't need mates to reproduce, and they're a single sex species. So if they pair with anyone, they'll do it just for the sake of enjoying their presence, and not in the same way that most species would do so. So pairing isn't even really the best way to represent it. It even states here that they tend to be polyamorous, but again, that's more of like a social thing. They're not doing it for anything other than just the fact that they enjoy people. So, that being the case, they are incredibly interesting and very dynamic. They all start off relatively the same, but as they age, they become more unique and more individualistic. In fact, individualism is one of the core concepts of the Circes because that is how like their evolutions work. Each Surki will develop its own unique evolutions that help it do whatever it's trying to do based on the magic that they consume. They're a very interesting species, similar to cicada. They lay eggs. Those eggs can last for, 10 to 100 years, depending on when the generation dig happens, where they go to a new locale. It's all kinds of stuff. Also, interestingly, they're a Darklands native. So, one of the very few Darklands natives that we've seen so far, though I do know that Qianxia character guide is going to have at least one more for us. They're fascinating. But anyway, so the eggs are laid. The eggs stay dormant for up to like 100 years before the generation dig, and then they evolve into, or they hatch into these grubs. Now the grubs last. It doesn't really say how long until they eventually turn into adults, where they kind of get this more bug-like image, like the one you're seeing behind me here, and then eventually they'll adapt evolutions, which is considered the end or the last stage of their life cycle. And through each of these cycles, they are very, again, individualistic. Like the grubs, after they're born, they they can just go anywhere. They're pretty much no longer tended to by the families. They tend to stay within the farms of their whatever their like clan tribe, even though they don't really have such things. Whatever little village they're from, they tend to dig into the ground, soak up all the magical nutrients from magic around them, and they're told through like thumping and scraping the stories of whoever's tending the farm. It's very interesting. I do recommend definitely looking into the Surki like life cycle. It's very fascinating, but I don't want to get too hung up on it for the sake of this video. So beyond that, yeah, the grubs can kind of do whatever. They eventually evolve, and then they just kind of go and explore, and they don't really have like major family ties. Their names are very individualistic. In fact, their grub name or their root name is so specific that it's rude to come across another Surki who has the same, or to have another Surki take the same root name as them. So that's something that I find very fascinating about them. So looking at their general beliefs, they're all about self-discovery, traveling, exploration. Their edicts are encourage others to discover their true selves, protect and nurture natural ecosystems, work with others to promote symbiotic relationships, And that kind of ties into the fact that they are magiphages, which is something I'm going to get to in a minute. But they essentially absorb magic from everything around them. So they very much care about their environments because their environments are their food supply, which is very interesting. Now, their anathema are to force another to change before they're ready, which, is not really great for an anathema. That seems very specific, but in any regard, I find them very interesting. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at their stats. So, first of all, they're a rare ancestry. They do have an 8 hit points, which is pretty good, and they have a 25 speed, which is also good. Now, they're medium and they don't get to change size, which I actually find very strange about them, that they can't at least become large through feats or anything. But yeah, they're always medium unless something changes that for them outside of their ancestry. Now, they have 2 free attribute boosts. They have Constitution and a free one. No flaws, and I guess this makes a lot of sense. They always kind of evolve to fit whatever their environment is that they're going for. So that being the case, any flaws that would be produced would be won through how they live their life, not necessarily what is in a part of their ancestry. Now, for their abilities, they only have a couple abilities. First, they have Dark Vision, being native Darklanders. That makes a lot of sense. But they also have Magiphage. Now, Magiphage I mentioned earlier, but Magiphage is actually a very big part of the Surki because it determines how some of their later features work. So, for the Magiphage, you pick a tradition of magic, and that was the magic you fed on the most as a grub before you turned into your adult phase. Now, whenever you choose any feats or abilities that relate to a specific tradition, your Magiphage is what that tradition must be. So one of their early feats, for instance, gives them a cantrip from the tradition that they choose. So if you chose occultism, it has to be a occult spell or occult tradition. You have to choose an occult cantrip, and other feats must be occult as well. Something I find very fascinating. I also think this is very cool for the sake of determining maybe how some of their features might manifest. Like, how does primal wings differ from like occult wings or divine wings, for instance? Something I find very, very cool. So the Surki are really, really good at being very individualistic, being very unique. And they also kind of have some evolution stuff, which we're going to see here in just a moment, to make your character even more unique than other Surki might be, making them, again, perfect for adventures. But before we get to the heritages, if you all would like, subscribe to the channel. I talk about all things Pathfinder. I'm going to cover all the things here in Howl of the Wild, even after the book releases, which should be tomorrow from the time of the posting of this video, or today of the posting of this video if something happens. And as well, later this week, I'm going to be covering PaizoCon live and through videos. PaizoCon is going to be this weekend, so if you want to be a part of that, I definitely recommend joining our Discord, actually linked in the description below, where you'll get notifications when I go live, and I'll give announcements as well for how that's all going to work. In addition, like the video, it lets other people see the content. But let's go ahead and get to these Surki heritages, which is honestly going to be a very hard ancestry to go to versatile heritages, because the heritages themselves offers some really cool abilities, especially if you take the evolution feat that you can pick up at level 9. First up, we have the Breaker Surki. Now, you're going to notice that each Surki does have 2 evolutions. You get to pick one of these at level 9 if you select the feat. You can actually take the feat multiple times to select an additional evolution, and you can even select other heritages with another feat later. So don't worry, you don't have to pick between either of the evolutions. If you want to have both of them, you just need to take extra feats, which means you're going to have to spend typically 4 levels between evolutions. So anyway, back to the Breakers. The Breakers get a claw attack that is a d4 slashing damage, and they have the agile, finesse, and versatile bludgeoning. They're a slashing weapon. So overall, not a bad one. It is decent because it gives you versatile, giving you additional damage types, which I think is really cool. And it's agile. It's not hard to blend the use of the claws in with whatever combat style you're going with. But, like many other Ancestry claw attacks, they're not the greatest. They're not super great. So what evolutions are we looking at? The evolution, first one is you get wrist nodes that give you durable digging wedges. So your claws essentially can become bigger digging claws, more or less. As an action, you can increase your claw damage size to a d6 and grant it the magical and raising and versatile force traits, and you remove the agile trait. So it only says remove the agile trait. So technically, you get a d6 weapon that's magical, raising, versatile force, and versatile bludgeoning and finesse, because the only thing you remove is the agile trait. So you get a d6 unarmed strike that has five or five traits, which is absolutely insane. That's a lot. I'm actually surprised it just doesn't change into this other form. But yeah, all it says here is you remove the agile trait. That's it. So that's really, really cool. And you can switch between the two claws by spending an action if you want to get the agile trait back. But honestly, at this point, I don't know why you would go back to the D4 version unless you really were like specifically betting on that agile trait being there. The improved version is just better in almost every regard. The second evolution is really fun because you gain talons on your feet. Now, it doesn't specifically allow you to gain talon, like a talon attack. You still have your claw attack, but these do something different. So essentially, if any effect would force you to move 10 feet or more, you can reduce that distance by half, which can be good. It's not super common that player characters get shoved around, but it might. And if you're playing with a GM who's more cinematic, who likes just shoving the players around for the sake of making impact and narrative, this is even better for games like that. Now, also, the extra traction from these claws allow you to climb with one hand occupied. But if you have the climber feat, you can actually climb without needing to use either of your hands, just using your feet essentially, which is really good. Climbing is one of the biggest weak points in Pathfinder. The climber feat allows you to climb by holding a weapon, which can be good in some situations, but normally if you want to climb, you have to stow your weapons and then you have to climb, and then when you get to the top you have to redraw your weapons. In combat, climbing is super ineffective, but if you're a Surki, you can climb a lot more easily. If you have a one-handed build, then it's easy enough to do it. And if you take the climber feat, which is honestly not that hard to do, then you can be a two-handed weapon fighting Surki who can climb easily in combat without having to go through all the gut that other players have to do, which is really, really good in all honesty. And you also gain, in addition to these climbing features, an extra reaction. You get trench digging. Essentially, what happens is anytime you're subjected to forced movement as a reaction, you can deploy your claw spikes into the ground to tear the earth asunder. You create difficult terrain in each square you moved through the forced movement, which is kind of interesting. I don't know when this is good for you, because then it's difficult terrain for you, but there's so many different ways you can ignore difficult terrain of certain types that this might work with certain types of classes or feats or whatever. So that being the case, trench digging, honestly, might not be too bad. I think the rest of the feature for this evolution particularly makes this one really good. But as it being the case, trench digging just seems a little weird, but it's just a cherry on top. So you can take it or leave it. Next up, we have the Elron Surki. This is an adaptation that gives you kind of these. You can use your carapace as kind of like a glider, in the sense you don't glide, but you take no fall damage no matter how far you fall, which in itself is actually not that bad. And considering that this is the heritage that leads to flights for your character potentially, this is a really strong choice early game. So the first evolution is that you can cast fly as an innate spell on yourself once per day. And while you're flying, you can shed bright light in a 20-foot radius and dim light in another 20 foot. So you get to be a torch and you get to fly once per day. Now, unfortunately for the Surki, they don't get a true flight like some other Ancestries do. You only get this one version of flight, which is kind of sad because even the Automaton, who has similar features, can eventually just fly all the time. But the Surki really can't. They only get to cast fly on themselves once per day. But that's still pretty good, and you can pick this up at level 9, so you get essentially a level 9 fly speed that you don't need to take 2 other feats in order to select, which is something I am not particularly happy with, but flight, a lot of people like to say how great flight is, so I feel like it's balanced, don't get me wrong. It's just one of those things where I hate feat taxes more than anything, unless the feats are being just enhanced, in which case they're feat enhancements more than taxes. This one is good. The next one is kind of okay. So essentially, you you create like a unique membrane that you can use, kind of like a cricket, to create a sonic effect. So kind of a sonic effect. So you get the stridulating song action. Essentially, you create these big wings for 2 actions. You can do this once per day, and you vibrate these wings at a high speed, and you focus all the sound on one creature within 30 feet who must succeed a fort save against the higher of your class DC or your spell DC or whatever is higher, or they become sickened 1 or a sickened 2 on a crit failure. Now, the cool thing about this one and what makes it actually really, really strong is you can sustain this effect for up to a minute, and the enemy can't recover from the sickened condition for as long as your song can be heard by it. So, that being the case, you can make the enemy pretty much for the whole combat sickened 1 or sickened 2 if they crit fail the initial check, which is really good. So yeah, a second one that can't be easily gotten rid of is really good. And as soon as that creature dies, you can just stop sustaining it, meaning, it's as good as long as that enemy is alive. It's really, really good. So the stridulating song is very, very interesting. Honestly, the Elytron Surki are probably the strongest heritage, in my opinion. Next up, we have the Hardshell Surki. Now, this is the kind of typical, if your ancestry has some kind of carapace or armor effect, you gain armor through this one, and this is just the same. You gain a innate armor that's considered medium armor and gives you a +4 item bonus to AC with a dex cap of +1, a check penalty of -2, and a speed penalty of -5 with a strength requirement of 3. It does say 16 here. They did correct it in the errata. It is now just +3. It also has the comfort trait, which it has to, because otherwise you would always be fatigued. You can never wear other armor or remove your carapace, but you can etch armor runes onto your carapace. So if you want just free medium armor, I guess this is good. I never really found this particular type of feature in Ancestry to be really good, because there's so many good armors that you can wear, specific magic armors, rare material armors. It's something that, and not only that, but this is considered medium armor, so it's not even good for classes that normally don't get medium armor because they don't have the proficiency to really go with it, which is weird in a sense. But you get free armor that you can just etch runes into. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this one, but let's look at the evolutions and maybe that might change opinions on it. So the first one is a critical strike, essentially negation. So essentially, if you're struck by a critical hit that deals physical damage, must be physical damage, you can use your reaction to attempt a DC 17 flat check. If you're successful, the attack becomes a normal hit instead. It's okay. It's something that I wouldn't necessarily bank on. It fails more often than it succeeds. So yeah, I don't know. I don't find that one particularly convincing. Though let's look at the other one. So the next one gives us access to dampening harmonics. This is actually a very interesting effect, similar to how Stone Skin, or at least what used to be Stone Skin, used to work. So essentially, you gain 10 resistance to a damage dealt by spells and magical abilities of the trait of your Magiphage ability. So if you're a primal Magiphage, primal spells, or primal effects, rather. Except for the Force trait, which does suck if you're an arcane Magiphage, but them's the breaks. The Force field lasts for 10 minutes. Each time the field prevents damage, the duration decreases by 1 minute. So the dampening harmonics is probably one of the better ones in my opinion between the two. I mean, being able to negate a crit sometimes can be good, but and if you don't have a reaction, I guess why not? But the dampening harmonics at the very least can be really good, if especially if you're specifically like divine or arcane, as most casters in the game tend to be, like enemies tend to be one of those two, though there are a fair number of occult ones. I actually don't know how many primal ones there are. I'm sure there's some Fey specifically that are primal specifically, so if you're in a Fey heavy campaign, primal dampening harmonics might be a better one. But overall, Hardshell Surki is kind of sad. I I guess if you just don't care about wearing, better magic armor, and you just want to have armor with you, it's not a big deal. But for me, it just seems very limiting more than it does be helpful. And the evolutions are not too interesting to me. But hey, maybe one of you like this kind of idea, like this kind of character. So that being the case, maybe this one is for you. The last one we got here is the Lantern Surki. I know this video is going to be a little bit longer because all these heritages have so much attached to them. So bear with me. The Lantern Surki here has a inbuilt torch, more or less. As an interact action, you can shed bright light in 20 foot and dim in 20 feet. This is magical light with the level of effect of your own level, whatever that is. You can change the color of the light or extinguish it with another interact action. It's nice sometimes just having an inbuilt torch. Is this the best one at base? No, not really. But honestly, this is really good if you have a bunch of teammates who just don't have dark vision. And in fact, because this belongs to an ancestry that has dark vision innately, this feels a little bit extra bad. Granted, there's so many ways light can be used beneficially. And like I said, this can be really, really handy in a group that doesn't have dark vision. So, depending on your group or composition, Lantern Surki might be good at base. But let's talk about its evolutions because they're actually really cool. So the first one gives you a lantern beam, which is really cool. Now, in order to use the lantern beam, your lantern must be activated, so you must be shining. And essentially, you focus your light into a beam that deals 5d4 fire damage to all creatures in a 30-foot line, with a basic saving throw against the higher of your class DC or spell DC. And I think it doesn't state what the throw is here. That is strange. It should be reflex. Yeah, it should be reflex. Yeah, that's so strange they don't mention that. That's another error. It should be a reflex here. I don't remember if that got fixed in the errata. Maybe it did. But after you use this, your lantern light then extinguishes, and you can't use your ability or your light again for a D4 rounds. At 11th level and every 2 levels thereafter, the damage increases by a D4. So I really like this one. I think this one is really cool, and the best part about it is Paizo's learned to make spell-like features work if they have like action requirements. So if you're out in broad daylight, you're not going to have your lantern out. So in order to get your lantern out, to use Lantern Beam, you have to use an action to bring the light out. But then it's only one action for Lantern Beam. So that being the case, you get essentially a spell, a 2-action spell that isn't any more excessively hard to use than any other spell. Now, the damage is not great for level name. 5d4 with a basic save is not great. A 30-foot line can oftentimes hit like a couple enemies. If you're in a hallway, this is probably really, really good if you're fighting a decent number of enemies for sure. And the damage does go up. The damage does heighten at 11th level and every odd level after that by a d4. So yeah, not bad. Not a bad area option. And plus, if you're already getting a lot of benefit from just being a light source for your group in general, then Lantern Beam is just a really good add-on if you don't mind shutting the lights out, suddenly. Which, by level 9, hopefully your group has more options for illumination than just your light. And the second evolution here is called Lantern Strobe, or gives you the Lantern Strobe action. Essentially, you have an additional light that you pulse, It's 2 actions, and you can use this once per hour, not once per day, which is kind of cool. And what this does is each opponent in a 15-foot cone must attempt a fort save against your class DC or spell DC, whichever is higher. On a failure, the creature is dazzled for 1 round, and on a crit failure, they're blinded for 1 round and dazzled for the following round. This one is pretty okay. Essentially, you just have an extra spell effect that you can use, and you don't actually need to have your light already active in order to use it, which is kind of cool. It's a 15-foot dazzle, essentially, spell that you can use. Not bad, for sure. Dazzled is pretty good, and if they crit fail, they're blinded and then dazzled for, blinded 1 and then dazzled for 1 round. So, not terrible for sure. I like the Lantern Beam more. I think that one's more fun and more cool. But Lantern Strobe definitely has its place and can be used in a lot of situations. All right, we're like almost 30 minutes and we're now getting to the feats. Oh boy. The feats aren't that bad, and a lot of them are pretty quick though, but this is still probably going to be a 40-minute video. So anyway, Sequestered spell, first rank spell that we're getting here. This one is one I've mentioned prior. You gain a cantrip from the spell list of your Magiphage ability. That's it. Not bad. It's pretty good if you want to add a little bit of extra spell casting. There's so many good utility spells that you can just throw onto your character. Like if you're not a Lantern Surki, you can just pick up the light cantrip, and it's very handy to have. Granted, for your teammates, because you can see in the dark. So yeah, I like Sequestered spell. I think it's really good, and there's just many good cantrips out there. And there will be more and more cantrips added to the game, so this one will just stay viable for as long as the game runs. So this one gets a big thumbs up for me. It's really good. Next up, we get Small Speak. This one's very interesting because it essentially allows you to ask questions of insects, arthropods, and terrestrial invertebrates. Now, the part about this one that I think is funny is, while this one should be useful because there's many, many bugs out and around, many insects, like ants or bees, for instance, tend to be more on the hive mind aspect, which means they're relatively mindless and they can't really give you answers. So it's actually a little bit harder to find an insect you can actually talk to than it might first appear. So that being the case, Small Speak can be good, probably one of the easiest ones to make good use of if you're playing on a terrestrial campaign. But then again, you also have to ask, what does an insect know? What does it have to offer? Which might make it more limiting. So this one is, I think, generally okay. You might get some use out of it, or you might just end up talking to a bunch of mindless bugs. Who knows? But Small Speak is okay. Surki lore. This one is probably one of the worst lores just because the Surki culture is very small, specific, and individualistic. I just can't see the additional lore for Surki lore being that good. Though you might know about some magical events that have happened in the past told to you by, your whoever raised you, which is cool because the Great Generation dig always goes towards these big events that happen that kind of change the flow of magic in areas, so it could be useful. Though honestly, you would only select Surki lore really if you want to pick up survival plus an additional skill proficiency equal or that is the same as your Magiphage or the associated skill. So Arcane for Arcana, Nature for Primal, yada yada. So yeah, 2 skill proficiencies and a somewhat specific lore skill. I'm not so sure Surki lore is worth it, but maybe it'll work for your campaign. Who knows? Surki weapon familiarity. Now, a lot of people don't like weapon familiarity because most martial classes already get access to all the weapons. And if they don't give you access to an advanced weapon, what's the point? But if you're playing a class like the Alchemist currently, or maybe a spellcaster who wants to use a weapon, they can be really good. The Surki gives you access to picks, light hammers, sickles, and scythes. But the really cool part is you get access to 1 additional common weapon of your choice from the axe or hammer group. That's the one that I think you're going to use this one for a lot, as this will give you access to a potentially really good, it has to be common, sure, but it can give you access to like a war axe, for instance. So that being the case, it also makes all weapon proficiencies go down by a step, martial to simple, advanced to martial, all that kind of stuff. And you get crit specialization at level 5. So not bad. I really like this one just for the simple fact that you get to choose essentially the last weapon in the familiarity from either the axe or hammer group. So, I think this one can be used in a lot of very interesting ways. So this one, it gets a thumbs up from me. Next up, we get Vestigial Magic Sense. This one is a vague sense, which is I don't even know how referenced it is in the book. A vague sense just means that if you're within 30 feet, or at least for this one, it gives you a 30-foot range of the same type of magic as your Magiphage. You know it's there. So that's it. You don't know a direction. You can't identify a location. You walk into it's like you walk into a bakery and you're like, oh, I can smell the bread. You might not know exactly where the bread is. You might have a hard time identifying where the smell comes from, but you know that bread is being made there. So this one can be pretty handy because it does tie into essentially it ties into a tradition of magic, which can be very useful. And this kind of gives you the same general effect as detect magic. It's just not exactly the same and doesn't heighten. So yeah, you can walk into an area and if there's magic there within 30 feet of you, you can detect it. I don't think it's bad. I think this one can be used in a lot of ways. It's just kind of weird. And I honestly would have probably preferred just detect magic instead of this vague sense of smell for magic. But I think it's interesting nonetheless, and it has some very interesting roleplay potential as well. All right, level 5, we have Chemical Trail. This one allows you to gain a +1 circumstance bonus to all checks and saves to sense direction or to reorientate yourself. You essentially leave a little chemical trail wherever you go, making it easy for you to retrace your steps. Interesting in some ways, this one can come up. I don't know how often I would select this one, to be fair, but I do think it can be useful. So Chemical Trail is pretty okay. The next feat, though, I think a lot of Surki are probably going to end up selecting. This one is Secondary Adaptation. Now, it's funny it says Secondary Adaptation because technically you can select this if you don't have one of your Heritage's feats. There's nothing here that excludes the use. It says just choose one Surki heritage that you don't already have. You gain that heritage and its benefits and potential evolutions. So yeah, if you're going the versatile heritage for Surki, then secondary adaptation can be really good to allow you to select the evolutions that you wanted that you might not be able to get from whatever versatile heritage that you went with. So that being the case, secondary adaptation is really good and it can give you a second set of ancestry or heritage abilities, which can be really good. So I think this one is very solid. All right, next up we have Tunnel Roll, and this is probably one of the more useless feats. And there's a lot of text here, and I don't even want to go over it all. So essentially, 2 actions. You roll up into a ball and then can move up to 4 times your speed in a straight line down an incline. Has to be down an incline specifically. So this one might be useful in some situations. If an incline is not considered steep enough for a fall, it can be good. But whenever you get to the bottom of the incline, you stop and you unroll essentially. Now, if you don't get to the bottom of an incline, you can actually keep rolling, but you're slowed too each turn that you keep rolling. So it's a sustained 2 action effect, which is bonkers. And if you hit an obstacle on a turn after the first, you and the obstacle both take 4d6 bludgeoning damage and you stop rolling. So I don't know how often rolling downhill is going to be super advantageous. I don't know if rolling 4 times for 2 actions is going to be worth it. This might be able to be used, but this feels like a feat that someone would select just to see if they can use it in a campaign and not because they think it's going to be particularly useful. I don't like Tunnel Roll. I think this one is bad. I think it's funny. I think it can be interesting. And there might be some fun ways to use this, but it's just bad in my opinion. I don't know. I don't like this one particularly. You might, but for me, this one is kind of a stinker. All right, up to 9th level. This is the big one. So the first we get is Consume Magic. A very interesting one, and one I kind of would have tweaked to be a little bit different. So Consume Magic is a reaction you can use once per hour, which isn't bad. And its trigger is you attempt a saving throw against an area effect from the tradition matching your Magiphage ability. So you actually can counteract the effect either using your class DC -10 or using your spellcasting ability modifier and spellcasting proficiency in order to counteract the area effects. Now, if you succeed in the counteract, you end the effect for all creatures in the area, but you become sickened one as your body struggles to absorb the influx of magic. I don't know why this can't be used for like a singular spell, more or less. Like, I don't know why it's harder to eat like a single bolt of fire rather than like a fireball. It just doesn't make sense. What I would have done for this one personally was it can be used for any spell used against you or any area spell or area effect. And if you do the area effect, you become second one. But if it's only one against you, then you don't become second one. That's what I would have done. I think that would have made this one a lot better. But I do think this one is actually pretty good. Most spells tend to be, if they do damage, in an area. That's how magic casters tend to do a good amount of damage, is by hitting multiple enemies. So this one can come in handy a lot, especially if you have a Magiphage that's similar to the campaign that you're in. You do a lot of traveling, divine, primal, really good. If you're dealing with cults, arcane, occult can be really good. So yeah, consume magic is pretty decent, I'll say. I won't say it's good because it's very specific, but because you can use it at least once per hour. Hey, in some dungeon runs, this might be actually useful. So consume magic gets a big thumbs up from me. Finally, Grand Metamorphosis. This is the big feat because this one gives us access to our evolution. So this one has a requirement that you have a Surki heritage, and you gain one of the heritages, or one of the evolutions for the heritage. If you have multiple heritages, you must choose one to evolve. And this one also has a special here that says that you can take this multiple times, and you can even get multiple evolutions for the same heritage, which allows you to get essentially both. So at most, any Surki can have 3 evolutions, which is honestly not that bad if you took a prior feat to select another heritage. So I like this one. This one's really cool. It gives you access to some of the coolest abilities that Surki gain access to. Honestly, to me, Grand Metamorphosis is a must-take. Also here at level 9, we get Nodal Healing, which is actually a unique thing for, not unique, but it's actually really interesting that the Surki actually gain a lot of healing abilities. So Nodal Healing gives us, whenever you can take a 10-minute rest, and you can regain hit points equal to your Constitution modifier times half your level, which is pretty good. This is considered magical healing and is cumulative with any effects you would receive from treat wounds. So Nodal Healing is pretty good. You can rest, get some extra HP. If you don't have a class that has infinite hour combat healing, then this one is a pretty good one to select. At level 13, we have Generation Digger. This one's really, really good because it just gives you a 15-foot burrow speed, which honestly, burrow speeds are really solid. They're hyper defensive. You can dig underground. If an enemy doesn't have burrowing, they just can't follow you. So it's a great get out of jail free card. I really like Generational Digger. The only problem is, since we don't have any tremor sense, you can't see anything once you go underground. But that being the case, I still think it's really solid. Also at level 13, we have Magitaxis, which is just Magic Taxi, really. And it's a very interesting one. I think it has some interesting uses. So it's a reaction. Its trigger is a creature you could reach with a single stride action, casts a spell with a tradition matching your Magiphage. And it's a reaction that lets you stride and end your movement adjacent to the triggering creature. You can't use this again on the same creature for 24 hours, though you can still use this one for other creatures. And you can use this in tandem with other types of movement if you have those types of movement. So this is potentially really interesting. Now, offensively or in combat, this one's a little bit more difficult because you have to rely on an enemy using a type of magic that you have. But the real strength of Magitaxis is if you have an ally spellcaster who's using a magic tradition that your Magiphage is attuned to, then as a reaction, you can move to an ally during when they cast a spell, which can be really good. It makes you really good defensively. It can get you out of potentially some bad situations. in combat, there's a lot of ways that in tandem with another teammate, this one can be really good. Granted, once per day, but multiple teammates might have the same tradition. So there's definitely ways Magitaxis can be used in a fun and dynamic way. I I think this one is just a little bit more big brain than a lot of people tend to be used to for the use of abilities. A lot of people might snub up on this one, but given the right situations and right tactics, this one is actually pretty decent. All right, next up is unlimited pluripotency. I don't know what pluripotency is. I don't know what that is supposed to be. But anyway, so essentially every day when you rest, you can decide to change one of your heritages if you have multiple heritages, or your heritage if you have only one. Now, when you do this, you do descend into a deeper sleep than normal, so you can't be woken up by shouting or the sounds of combat. Someone actually has to come shake you awake, which can be dangerous, give or take, but more often than not, you're just going to be able to use this pretty unimpeded. And once you do this, during your next daily preparations, you can just select a different Surki heritage. And if you had one or more evolutions from that heritage that you swapped, you can choose new evolutions from your new heritage. So this one can be really good if you want to have a Surki that's more based on evolving for the moment. Really good, I think, with Inventor. It really plays into the idea that you can just prepare for whatever with enough prep time kind of thing, which I think is very cool. Though I don't know how often someone might take this over just, selecting another evolution if they're really going down the evolution route. As this one, I mean, it just means that you selected a heritage that you just weren't confident you were going to use a lot. So that being the case, I think this one's pretty okay. I think this one can be used in some very interesting ways, but it's not a big wow factor for me. I think it's decent for character ideas and thematics more than it is mechanically super useful. And the last feat here is Nodal Regeneration. This one is actually really, really good because essentially you can cast on yourself Regenerate once per day, allowing you to even regrow limbs or any damage. Granted, that doesn't happen too often in game, but still can be very useful. And rather than this regeneration being deactivated by acid or fire, your regeneration is actually stopped by cold, which cold damage is not super common as far as enemy damage types, depending on the area you go to. If you're in a cold region, then yeah, of course, but everywhere else, not so common. Now, you can only cast a spell on yourself, but you can cast the spell as a reaction if you're reduced to 0 hit points by a non-cold effect spell, meaning you're going to be up next round, which is really good. So Nodal Regeneration is really, really good, and if you're not going the full evolution route, I think Nodal Regeneration is probably a must take at level 17. And yeah, that's the Surki. Oh, a bit of a longer video than some of the other ones. They just have so much, but I always love any kind of ancestry that has evolutions that can be just more dynamic and interesting. They're very similar to the automaton that way, and automaton is kind of one of my favorite ancestries. And they're very interesting. Lore wise, they're very interesting, and I think that they're very unique. This is an ancestry that I definitely would consider playing, and I'm a human supremacist. I like my human characters. I want to be characters that I can not empathize with, but I can see myself as, and I like myself as I am. So that being the situation, I think that this is really cool, and I would actually play a Surki, which should speak volumes for those who know me. Anyway, that's gonna be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and good luck evolving. Bye.